Hello students, this is a tutorial about how to make a toaster, which is an introduction to your 2 kitchen appliances assignment, and just kind of a basic sort of primer for how to do that sort of thing. As is mentioned in the assignment, I always think it's a good idea to start with a sketch. That way you can solve a lot of your problems, 3-dimensional problems or topology problems on paper initially. And I think I know how I want the topology of this toaster to go. I made this sketch. It just took me a few seconds, nothing really fancy. Made this sketch right before I started recording here. And this is roughly how I want the topology of this toaster to flow. So you can see that I've drawn edges here, just kind of a minimalist approach to a toaster here, and these edge loops that'll have to go all the way around. So let's get started on the toaster. First of all, I have my default cube here, and it's actually, a toaster's fairly cubic, so we're going to keep it. I'm going to tap 5 to go into an orthographic viewport instead of perspective, so that my computer screen is not trying to fool me into seeing things as far away or close up by messing with the apparent size of them. I want the size of things to be true to life. So the very front view, if I tap 1 on the number pad, the front orthographic view is this face that's along the y-axis right up here. So if I tab into edit mode and select that face, that's my front view. So I'm going to tab back out of edit mode, and for now I'm just going to tap SY to scale in the y-axis. I'm going to stretch this out until, to me, it looks about like a toaster. We're not really building a piano here, so this doesn't have to be super precise, but to me that looks about like a toaster should look. So now I'm going to tab into edit mode, and I'm going to start making some loop cuts. So if I hit Control R, that's my shortcut for a loop cut, and I can mouse up and down to determine how many cuts I'm going to make. And they always preview, it's always going to cut perpendicular to the edge that my mouse is over. So I'm going to make 2 cuts here, and I'm going to opt out of the sliding portion of this command. I don't want to slide. I'm going to hit escape because I want those to be exactly centered. And by default, that's what they do. So I'm going to leave those there. I want them a little bit closer together since this is a cube. Since these are straight edges, I'm not going to distort the shape at all by doing this, so I can just, while I have these 2 edges selected, I can tap S to scale and X to constrain my x-axis and bring them a little closer together. And that works perfectly. Okay, so now I'm going to select these top 2 faces, and I'm going to tap I to inset, and I'm going to start creating an inset here for my toaster slots. And basically these are just extra faces. There's no depth to them yet. I add depth by tapping E to extrude and then pushing them downward. And I need to know how much to push them downward, so let's tap Z to go into a wireframe view and go to our side view. Now I've finished my extrusion command. I can't just keep dragging these. So I'm going to load my cursor with the selected faces by tapping G, and now I'm in a move command, and I can constrain my axis by tapping Z. I can move these down to where they go close to the bottom of the toaster. Now if I tap Z and gesture to the right, I have pretty good slots for the toaster. And that's actually a pretty good approximation of how I want the toaster to look. So I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, so now we can start adding some details to the toaster and getting a little bit fancy. For instance, most toasters have a little lever out here. We need a little inset for that lever. So let's select this face and tap I to inset that. We're going to kind of do the same sort of thing here. Then extrude to push that inward. We just have a narrow little slot there for our toaster lever. and that'll work out nicely. Now I'm going to add a new cube that I can use. Well, you know what? We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's keep working on our toaster here. So I'm going to tab out of edit mode. I'm going to name my object. Right now it's just called cube. I'm going to double click here and call it toaster, because it's a good idea to keep your objects named. And now I'm going to start making the coils for the toaster. So the coils are kind of a funny thing. They're going to be pretty easy to make, but you kind of have to have a vision of them in your head first. So I'm going to add a new cube. So Shift A, go to your mesh menu and add a new cube. And you can see that that's really kind of occupying a lot of the same place as our toaster. I'm going to scale this thing way, way down until it's very small, and then move it up outside of the toaster. Let's get a good side view of this thing. And then I'm going to scale this in the y-axis until it's about the same length as our toaster slots. And that's a little too long. SY, scale it back. Okay, that's probably a good size. And you know what? I think it can even be skinnier, because this is going to be the wire for our coils. So let's scale this in, we want to scale it in Z up and down, and Y, or sorry, and X side to side, but not Y, because that's the length, which we have about right. So I've tapped S to scale. Shift Y will exclude the Y-axis, and now we're just kind of making it skinnier. So let's give this thing a name. Instead of cube, we'll call this coil wire. And tab into edit mode on this, and I'm going to do a loop cut on this thing, and I'm just going to make a bunch of loop cuts, just maybe about that many, however many that is. I don't want to slide. I'm going to hit escape to opt out of that. And from a side view now, I'm going to deselect every other one of these. We're going to use these bisections to bend our coil. So I'm going to I tapped C to get my circle select cursor brush, and now I'm middle clicking on every other loop here to just deselect them. Okay, and I'm going to select the very end to make sure I have every other one. And then I can just grab each of these in the Z-axis and move them like that. Tab back out of edit mode, go back into our shaded view, and you can see that we've made a really rough approximation of a coil. If we want this to look a little better, we can go over here to our modifier stack and add a subdivision surface modifier just to smooth things out. And that looks a little bit better. It looks a little pointy on the very ends. So I'm going to do one more loop cut and slide it to kind of the end there. We can also rotate these guys around a little just to kind of give the ends a little bit more of a blunt feel. Rotate that as well. Okay, so that's going to be a pretty decent looking coil. Let's put that into position. Grab an X, and from our top view we can see we can get that just about over to the edge of our slot and just kind of push it down in here. Great. So we have one coil now, and we need a whole bunch of them. But that's pretty easy. We've been using our modifier stack here for a subsurf modifier. Now let's use an array modifier. So if we stick that into our coil, and let's look at our Okay, so you can kind of see what's happened here if we've gotten in close. With the array modifier, we can turn it off and on. There's a coil right next to the other coil. We actually don't want it right next to it in the x-axis. So currently the offset is one of our objects, one object width in the x-axis. Let's move that to 0, x, y, and z. Let's offset this in z by a negative value. Let's say -2 and see what that looks like. Okay, that looks a little more like what we need to happen. So currently our count is set to 2 objects. Let's increase our count so that it fills that side of our toaster. And that looks pretty good. So we can collapse this array modifier now. We don't need to mess with that anymore. Let's make another one. So another array modifier, and this one we are going to separate it in x, but we're going to have to figure out what our offset should be by just kind of sliding on this. So we'll slide that across to the other side. And because our first array modifier is up above it, let's call this vertical array. This next one we can call it horizontal array. Because our vertical array is up above it in the modifier stack, this horizontal array modifier carries with it all of the effects of both the subdivision surface modifier and the vertical array modifier. So we're stacking our modifiers up here, which is why it's called the modifier stack. Okay, now I think if I increase my count here to 4, I have not spaced these bread slots in such a way that that really works. So let's put our count back down to 2, and we'll come up with another horizontal array modifier. And we'll just keep moving it in the x-axis until it lines up with our other bread slot. Okay, we now have slots full of coils. So we'll give this one a name, horizontal array 001. Okay, so there are all of our array modifiers. And really, we only have, if we tab into edit mode, you can see the only thing we can edit is that first coil. And the advantage of that is that anything we do to that first coil happens to all of the other coils. So if I add a material to that first coil to make it glow and look red hot, all of these other coils are going to inherit that material. And that's a really powerful way to do that. So next problem, our toaster is pretty sharp edged. Like if somebody were to actually try to make toast on this, they'd probably cut their fingers. So let's put in a subdivision surface modifier on the toaster here and see what happens, and that's pretty awful. So let's tab into edit mode and have a look at what's going on. And we can actually, so the subdivision surface modifier is one way to do that. Another way to affect this would be to use our bevel modifier. So let's do that. Let's look at our bevel modifier. That actually looks a little more reasonable. That bevel's a little bit on the aggressive side, so I'm going to tone it down to 0.02 meters. And let's smooth out our corners with a couple more segments. And maybe just 0.027 meters. That actually looks pretty good. And we've got a little bit of weirdness here. That's because of the way I made the topology here. And honestly, doing this tutorial on the fly, I'm going to do a couple of experiments and see if I can fix that. I might not be able to. I might have planned my topology poorly for that. But let's experiment here and see what we can figure out. Nope. Clamp overlap. Loop slide. Harden normals. Nope. Limit method, none. Angle. Oh, there we go. Look at that. Limit method. We changed the limit method to the angle and it cleaned up our topology there. So, yay for Blender. Yay for the developers who built that in. That's pretty awesome. So now we've got this bevel modifier. You can see it's still a little faceted here. Since the bevel modifier is top in the stack, if we were to add a subdivision surface modifier underneath it now, then it still looks messed up. So let's leave that alone. Okay, the other thing we can do here is actually we can go to our object menu and we can shade smooth, and that'll clean that up. Okay, so next thing we're going to tackle is we're going to put in our handle here, our toaster handle. So I'm going to, just like with the coils and the toaster itself, I'm going to have this start life as a cube. Shift A, mesh, cube. And we'll scale that way down until it looks about the right size. Grabbing Y. About the right size for our handle, so we'll scale this in X, scale this in Z, and I'm going to say let's shorten it in Y too. We'll just kind of place that maybe a bit longer in Y. Okay, that looks pretty good. And let's round that out so it's a little bit more of a pleasant design. Subdivision surface. That's 2 rounded. So if I tab into edit mode on this, you can see the original cube shape. One thing I kind of like to do with my subsurf modifiers is I like to click this little button here, which applies the modifier to the edit cage. So now if I tab into edit mode, you can actually see where the edges and vertices and faces are being shown by the modifier. So if I hit Control R and do a double loop cut on this thing, you can see we've made a little bit more of a pill here. I'm going to scale this in X, and you can see that the closer these edges get to the outer edges, the less rounded they become. So I'm just going to kind of calm that roundness down a little bit, and I'm going to do the same thing vertically here. Scale in Z, not too much. I mean, we want this to be kind of rounded and pleasant. I'm going to flatten it quite a bit on the back though. Control R and just move this back quite a bit. Not to where it's perfectly flat, but to where it's sort of a D shape. Okay, and that I think is a reasonably pleasant handle. So now I'm going to go to my object menu and I'm going to shade this smooth. And that actually is pretty reasonable for a toaster handle. Okay, next thing, most toasters usually have some sort of control for how dark do you want your toast. So I'm going to use a cylinder for this, and so Shift A, mesh, well, let's create a cylinder, and we're going to need to play with some options here. This little twirl down here gives us some options to play with our cylinder. The biggest thing that we need to get rid of is this cap fill type, which is set to N-gon. N-gons are usually a bad practice. If you're passing an object on for animation, or even for adding materials and textures to it, it's usually a bad idea to model with N-gons. So I'm going to change that to a triangle fan. Triangles aren't ideal, but they're a better option than N-gons. So now I'm going to say we probably don't need 32 vertices of resolution. This is going to be a little on the small side, so let's just go 24. And now we'll scale it down, scale it in the Z-axis. We're going to rotate X 90 and G, Y, bring this out to the front, G, X, bring it to the side, G, Z, bring it down. And you know what? I think I want this knob to be on the left side of the toaster, so I'm going to scoot that over. Let's look at this from a side view and really kind of scoot it up against the surface so that it looks right. Okay, and that's a pretty boring toaster knob. So I'm going to tab into edit mode. I'm going to do a loop cut here, and then I'm going to circle select all of these other, let's go into face select mode here, all these other faces, option click to and hold down shift to select this loop in addition. I'm going to scale these down. but not in the y-axis. So Shift Y, and we'll just kind of give this knob a little bit of character here. Okay, double tap A to deselect. And I'm going to taper this just a little bit, but not as much, so that it's kind of a little happier shape. And then I'm going to tab out of edit mode. I'm going to go to my object menu and smooth shade this thing. Starting to look a little bit weird. I'm going to add a modifier. I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier, and then I'm going to tab back into edit mode, apply my edit cage, and I'm just going to do a few more subdivision surface, or a few more loop cuts, not quite all the way to the edge, so that this thing has a little bit more of a distinct shape, but that it's also realistically rounded, as though it could exist in the real world. So that's a bit more of a pleasant shape. That's better. Okay, so I think my toaster is probably ready for some materials, and toaster materials are usually pretty easy. So we've got our default cube here. Actually, you know what? Let's follow our own advice here. Let's name our objects. So instead of cube, we'll call this toaster lever. And instead of cylinder, we're going to call this one toaster knob. Okay, now let's select the main body of the toaster, go into our materials tab here. You can see, since it was the default cube, it already has a material applied to it called material. Let's rename that to toaster metal. I'm going to open the preview just so we can kind of see it here. And the base color is white. So we are going to increase our specular and decrease our roughness so that this thing becomes very reflective. And we'll change our base color a little more on the gray side. And this metallic slider here, what that's going to do is that's going to change the color of our reflections, like metal actually does in the real world. So we want this to be quite metallic. And it looks to me like it's actually making it reflect more, which is sort of a surprise to me, but maybe that's something it does. So if we click on our rendered preview, Eevee is going to give us a little bit of kind of a preview, but nothing really spectacular to write home about yet. Okay, next let's click on our plastic knobs and create a new material. This, I think I just want these to be really, really dark gray so that they're almost black. I think I want a little less roughness so that they're mostly kind of a polished plastic but not super reflective. We're going to call this black plastic. We're going to, you can see that is now applied to our toaster lever. I'm going to click on the toaster knob, and I can click this little icon here for a list of materials I've already made, and I can apply black plastic to the toaster knob as well. Alright, now if I click on my coils, we are going to create an emissive material for those. So let's click New. We're going to call this Coil Glow. And instead of a principled shader on the surface, we're going to opt out of that and change to an emission shader. And that emission shader, the color is going to be kind of a orangey red. And at this point I'm going to switch over to cycles so I can see a bit more accurate light. So render engine, we'll change that over to cycles. You can see now our reflections and our light are showing up. If we deselect everything, I'm going to say that's a little bit too magenta for red hot metal. So let's shift that over to the orange side of things. That's a little better. Okay, if I really want that to glow, then I can increase the strength. The more you do so, the more white hot it appears, and that's fairly realistic. And of course, if you want things to look reasonably good. It helps to put a floor underneath. So Shift A, click on a plane. We need to move it down underneath the toaster, so GZ -1, and then scale it up by maybe a factor of 10. And suddenly there's a little bit of environment for our reflective toaster to actually reflect. So that improved the looks of it quite a bit right there. But that's a quick and easy way to make a toaster. And just a few little tips to use along the way in making your kitchen appliances for your assignment. So I hope this was helpful, and thanks for watching, and have a good evening.